Hey listeners, it's Jana. Welcome back to Grief Out Loud. This episode is the third and final in our three-part series focused on stories from folks in the LGBTQIA+ community. If you missed the first one with Nev Fall, or the second with Mark Chestnut, be sure to check them out. Like I mentioned in the last one, we didn't intentionally plan for these episodes to fall in June, which is Pride Month, but it still feels like a timely accident. This episode and the entire series is part of an ongoing collaboration between Dougy Center and the New York Life Foundation, meant to ensure that voices from historically and currently underrepresented communities are heard in the grief world. We are deeply grateful for New York Life Foundation's tireless support of and advocacy for children and teens who are grieving. Today, we're reuniting with Camila, who first joined us 6 years ago to talk about her mother, who died unexpectedly in her sleep when Camila was just 21. Now, Camila returns with a new chapter in her grief, one that involves caring for her father, who was living with dementia and Alzheimer's disease. In this conversation, we explore how different types of grief can coexist and intersect in our lives. Camila opens up about the unique challenges of long-distance caregiving, the pain of losing her father as a keeper of her mother's memory, and how she's navigated major life milestones, including a pandemic, marrying her wife, and adopting their crew of tiny dogs without her mother's presence. This is a deeply honest conversation about the longevity of grief, the complexity of family dynamics, and finding moments of connection, even in the midst of loss. Camila and I have known each other for many years, and one of the ways we stay connected is through her poetry. Every few months or so, she'll write a new one and send it to me. They are all about grief in some way or another, and she gets right to it, putting words to emotions and experiences that often feel unexplainable. She's self-published 3 books of poetry, and I'll link to them in the show notes. Okay, here's our conversation. Camila, welcome back.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I can't believe it's been 6 years since the last time you were on Grief Out Loud. That feels like a lifetime ago.
It's been a long time.
Well, for listeners who didn't catch our first episode, catch us up on your history with grief.
Yeah. My mom died unexpectedly in her sleep when I was 21 years old. She was an eccentric, funny, amazing, outgoing person. She was a force. She was a leader in the community that I was raised in. Her and my dad and other extended family have run a soup kitchen in San Francisco for the last 50 years. So she wielded power. She knew how to make things happen and communicate with people and make each individual person feel special and feel loved. When she died unexpectedly, I was the one that found her. She died in her sleep. It broke my universe in half. There was the world before she died and the world after she died, and it would never be the same. That was grief at a magnitude that I never could have expected.
I remember those early days of knowing you pretty soon after your mom died, and to have watched you piece your world back together, knowing that there's always going to be that piece of your mom not there, but to watch you piece things back together for yourself. Been a great privilege of mine.
Thank you. Yeah, she died in 2009. So it's strange how many years it's been since then and how much she still is on my mind all the time. But it just has morphed over the years.
What's new in your grief sphere since we last talked?
So in the last several years, my dad has had dementia and Alzheimer's and has needed more and more care. And I stepped in 2020 to take over his finances. And it was from there that I was became more and more involved in sort of taking over the management of his life and trying to make sure that he remained safe and engaged. And it has been a whole new kind of grief and such a struggle in ways that I didn't experience in the grief of my mom.
And you're doing all of that long distance as well.
Yes, my dad is in San Francisco and I am in Portland.
You sort of mentioned this a little bit, but what are you noticing about what feels different or what feels similar in the grief of your mom who died so suddenly and unexpectedly, and this more long term caregiving of your dad in his decline?
Grief that I'm experiencing with losing my dad so slowly is all of the shared history and shared pieces of our lives. And it's not happening all at once, it's happening slowly over time. So, something that I've thought a lot about is how my dad and I bonded so much over the loss of my mom. We talked every year on the anniversary of her death. We talked about how surreal time is in relation to grief. We talked about her and how important she was, not just to us, but to everyone, and the ways in which our lives have changed because of her absence and then also because of her presence. And he has lost so much of those memories that it's really hard to feel the loss of that. He doesn't remember my childhood anymore. He remembers when he sees a picture of my mom, he says, "That's my wife." He knows who that is, but he has asked me who my mother is in the last year, and not understanding the way that my sister and I, like who we are to each other. We have different fathers, but we have the same mom. He's lost the structure of how our family is put together. And that feels like such a fundamental part of who we all are, is knowing like who our family is and how we got here. And he doesn't have that history anymore.
So in a sense, your dad has been a co-archivist with you for your mother and your mother's life and what she meant to you and to your community. And you're slowly losing the other keeper of those stories.
Yes. Yeah. He has become sort of a shell of himself, and there are ways in which he is like a sweeter version of himself. So often, people with Alzheimer's or dementia have a lot of sort of mood-based difficulties or challenges, and he really hasn't, and that's been a gift. But the connection is very difficult, and it when I'm with him, I just have to be present moment only, and it's hard to be in the presence of someone and not want to bring up things from the past, even if, you're just like, hey, remember that trip that we took? Or, when we went to this or when we did this, and not being able to connect on any of that and just kind of having to be in that moment alone.
What else have you learned in the last few years about caregiving for a parent?
I've learned a lot about elder care in this country and the many flaws and the ways that we are, I think, failing seniors in this country. I've just learned a lot about sort of sacrifice, and also I personally am someone that is extremely organized. It's something that comes very naturally to me. But I've had to take those skills to another level, because caring for another person in this way, there's just so many things that you don't realize you need to think about until they're at the forefront. So being in touch with his primary care doctor and then his eye doctor, and then remembering like, oh, the dentist and then the podiatrist, and just so many more pieces than maybe I personally have. I've also just learned a lot about dementia and Alzheimer's, and I think that there's a certain level of understanding that the public has with that, and then there's a lot that is misunderstood. Losing one's memory also means that your body is forgetting how to function, essentially. Like you're losing, it's not just, I can't remember someone's name or I can't remember why I walked in the room or whatever, but it's losing the memory of how to cook for yourself or that you need to eat or the way that you take care of your body with like hygiene and things like that. And it's just a much fuller picture than I think people realize. It's also hard because it's not linear in a certain way. So you can't plan it out like, okay, the first year it's going to look like this. So it's been kind of this constant get to a little bit of a stable place, and then there's another decline, and then there's another scramble for how do we get more care? How do we manage this? How do we keep him safe? What does this look like?
I was thinking about how if you are caregiving for a young child, there's these different milestones that get met or things are changing all the time, but they're changing in a little bit, not always, but they're changing somewhat in a more predictable pattern of more autonomy and more accumulation of skill. And then this other end of things where it's not very predictable and it's a loss along the way. Accumulation or decumulation? That's not a word, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this experience has felt like my dad is becoming more childlike. And so it's that interesting, like, at what point in the development is he? There's like situations where he really wants to help, just like a child really wants to help, but then giving them age appropriate things for what to do. Okay, please put the plates on the table, or please grate the cheese, or do these things, but needing it to be very one step at a time. I can't give you a recipe and say, follow this. I need to say, like, okay, chop this. Okay, now that you're done with that, let me give you the next task.
Regression. That's the word
Yeah.
I was going for, not deaccumulation. However, maybe there's a time and a space where that is an accurate word. How do you imagine things might be different in relationship to caregiving for your father right now if your mom were still alive?
I think that it would have been more about supporting her in the caregiving for him than being the person that is responsible for him. I am ultimately the person that makes all of the decisions. I have had help through this experience from my family and extended community, and my dad is loved by so many people. But there was a lot of this where I kept looking around, wanting to say, where is the adult? Who is going to tell me what to do in this scenario? And realizing that I had to make that decision. I'm in my 30s and not having, I don't have kids. It feels like it is a lot of responsibility. I think that if my mom were alive, just the dynamic would have changed so much. I can imagine, just like it has been for me, but I can imagine it would have been so challenging for her to start losing that connection with my dad. And even if we were in partnership, figuring out how best to take care of him, like she would have been the ultimate decision maker, and I would have been there to assist, as opposed to having a lot of people assist me, but then ultimately having to make those hard decisions.
Could have been sous chef instead of head chef,
Exactly.
to go back to the recipe analogy. Is there anything, and I don't mean this to sound like a gratitude for grief situation at all, but I'm curious if there's anything that you learned or developed in grieving for your mom that has helped you in this new situation of caregiving for your father?
I mean, I think losing my mom so suddenly, having her there one day and not there the next, and feeling like I just wish that I could hug her again. I just wish that I could be in her presence again. And even though my dad has lost so much of who he is, he's still here. And it's a complicated thing because he's here and he's not here. But essentially feeling like I do still get to fly down to San Francisco and see him. I do still get to hug him. I do still get to hold his hand as we walk down the street and feel his love for me. You know, he may not remember anything about our history together, but he's so excited every time he sees me. There's that recognition there. He may not always know my name. He may not even specifically be able to find the words to say, like, you're my daughter, but he looks at me and he points and he says, I know you. Or like, what are you doing? Yeah, the last time I visited him, he said, what are you doing here? So surprised. And just to feel even some of those slivers of joy amongst the grief is something that I don't get to experience with my mom.
So, a lot's happened in your life since your mom died. This small thing called a pandemic happened. This other small thing happened. You got married. You brought some animals into your family. What's it been like to have so many big life events occur without her?
I think this is where some of that surreal time warp happens with grief, where last year it was 15 years since she died. And that's a very, very long time. Like you said, a lot in my life has happened. And yet I still think about what it would be like to have her be part of my life were she to be alive. I, with the pandemic, my sister and I talked about this every so often. It was very hard to imagine what she would have done being in a pandemic. Like would she just have like left the city and holed up in a cabin for however long? Or, yeah, it's really hard to place her in that reality. As far as getting married, there were certain points within the process of wedding planning and thinking about how we wanted to do things that felt really hard that she wasn't here. I thought about her in relation to wedding dress shopping. And even though she wasn't really into shopping, but I just could sense that like that would have been a special fun experience had she been able to be there. There was a lot of thought that I'd put into the wedding dress, and for a very long time I was convinced that I would wear a purple dress to honor my mom because she purple was her color and she wore that all the time. And the morning that I was going to go dress shopping, my wife, Melissa, was telling me that I should just try on white dresses like while I was out because when am I going to do that ever again? And just to kind of keep the options open, there's no pressure either way. And it made me realize how much, I don't know if pressure is the right word, but I felt like there was this insistence of like, my mom isn't here, so I have to like help incorporate her into this wedding even more than if she were alive. And ultimately, I fell in love with very princessy white wedding dress that surprised me. And I realized that my wedding shouldn't be about my mom, even though there's ways of honoring her within that space, but it doesn't have to be like the focus of like that's what I'm wearing and it was just interesting to think about because I don't feel like have parents people that have parents that are alive don't necessarily have to think about that in those ways. Ultimately, we ended up having like accents of purple. My jewelry was purple and the tablecloths were purple, and we had like a memorial table with photos of my mom and photos of um, folks in Melissa's life that had passed away, and just realizing that there's other ways to bring her in. But the grief and loss of her has been such a huge part of my life as an adult that it feels strange to not like include her in significant ways.
It seems like a question of placement in a way. Where do I place my grief in this experience that I'm creating? And is it going to be the overarching theme of it? Is it going to be a portion of it? Is it going to be here on this table? And because it has been part of your life for so long and such a big part of your identity, I can imagine there being some confusion there of where to put it.
Yes. And there was the grief sprinkled throughout the planning process. And then it wasn't until like the night before the wedding when I just had my meltdown and my like, I can't believe my mom isn't going to be here tomorrow feeling.
How do you think Melissa, your wife, and your mom would get along?
I think they would get along so well. My mom, I could totally see my mom and Melissa bonding over astrology. My mom did a lot of charts and a lot of delving into the ins and outs of that. And Melissa loves having fun with pulling up, asking when and where you were born to pull up your stuff online. And I I love the image of the two of them just like chatting about that. I mean, I think both Melissa and my mom have such a generosity of spirit and are funny and just really loving towards people. And I just feel like they would have really loved each other.
Were there conversations that you imagined or wished you could have had with your mom and like getting to know Melissa and dating and getting engaged and moving forward with getting married?
I mean, I think even before those things, I wish that we could have talked more about sexuality. My mom has had dated and been with many genders, and I obviously like I knew that and we had talked, about it over the years, but I think that as I grew into a more comfortable spot with myself in my like late 20s, I wish that we could have had some of those conversations then to just I always loved hearing her perspective on things. It was just something that I don't remember us really talking about that much. And I feel like it became more of a forefront for me. And so, like, wanting to kind of feeling like I missed out on being able to connect with her about that. Yeah, as far as like when Melissa and I started dating and moving forward with that, I mean, I just feel like it would have been fun to watch them get to know each other. It's safe to say that my mom was my favorite person when at the time that she died. I was so attached to her and we had such a special bond. I felt like we didn't have this like tumultuous mother-daughter dynamic. It just felt very different. It felt like friendship. And Melissa is my favorite person in my life now. And like I just feel like it's really hard to feel like they both missed out on meeting the other one.
And then they would have had to duke it out over who was going to continue to be your favorite person. I'm curious, Camilla, because you accessed grief support for yourself after your mom died. You've accessed various kinds of support with caregiving for your dad. What has it been like to come into those spaces, which in general tend to be heteronormative, tend to be more cisgender women in the realm? What was it like to you to come into those spaces with different aspects of your identity?
I think that I was raised in a very alternative upbringing, and I always seem to recognize that the way I see the world and the way I see family and relationships can be very different from a more traditional setting. Even my parents, who, man and a woman, they were together and they lived separately. Like they created their relationship and their life in the way that worked for them and not based on what society says you should be doing in your relationship. I think in those grief spaces, I think there's an element in which being a queer person in a space that is more heterosexual, there is just kind of a general othering that I can feel. It's not that other people are doing anything to make me feel that way. It's just kind of a recognition of, or I guess in some ways, an assumption that I make of sort of someone else's life might seem more clear cut or more like roles are more defined. My family is who I consider to be family are basically the chosen family of my mom and my dad, but it there's like a lack of structure there. It's not always easy to sort of know my dynamic with people. Yeah.
If I'm hearing you correctly, it's almost you are used to being in a space or being in a space with yourself of like, I was raised maybe a little more non traditionally than all of my peers in school. Like that feels familiar. And also, there can be a few extra steps in a group setting to explain your situation. So when you say, this is this person who's like an aunt to me, but not an aunt, but was like a sister to my mom, but has always been part of our family, but even though we're not blood related, like sounds like there might just be extra explaining that needs to happen.
Yes, and also things like the soup kitchen that my family has run in San Francisco. There is a house that is a commune that is associated with the soup kitchen where core members that help run it live there. And my dad helped found that house in the mid 90s. And he, up until a couple of months ago, has been living there ever since. And explaining that to people, even just like in the social work field of trying to find services for my dad, when they ask me what his living situation was, having to say, well, he lives in a commune. No, it's not a group home. No, it's not a adult foster home. No, it's not, it's roommates, but kind of like it's complicated, and I feel like there isn't sort of being so like counterculture. It was something I felt very frustrated with as a child, having to explain things to kids that had no idea what I was talking about. And for the most part, as an adult, I have found it entertaining to share with coworkers and people like that these sort of eccentricities about my childhood. But in the land of trying to be the caregiver for my dad and then having to communicate with lots of people in and out, lots of bureaucratic systems, feeling like struggling to find the right words to describe the situation accurately.
What are you turning to these days to care for yourself and in your grief?
We have 3 dogs, so that is a lot of puppy cuddles and a lot of distraction. I have written poetry for a very long time, and I still use that as a way to process all of the feelings.
And you've got some books of poetry out in the world. How many are available?
I have 3 available. The first one, The Progression of Grief, is about the loss of my mom. And then New Waters, I wrote about falling in love with Melissa and how different being in a healthy relationship is from the relationships of my past. And my latest book, The Longevity of Grief, is about the grief of my dad and then how that is interwoven with the grief of my mom.
And listeners, I'm going to link to those books for you because I, again, have been privileged to be able to read a lot of Camilla's poetry over the years. Oftentimes, when she writes a new one, she sends it to me and then I get to read it, and there's a lot in there. So definitely want to check out those books. Camila, anything else you want to share today about living your life without your mom, living your life as a caregiver for your father and his cognitive decline?
I think that I've thought so much more about my relationship with my dad in the last few years as I lose him. And, I wrote a lot about my mom after she died and used those writings as such a way to reflect on the incredible person that she was. And in my teenage years, my dad and I were not as close. And it sort of felt like a lot of that melted away when my mom died. And we sort of bonded together in this new way. But I feel like it's been both a rewarding and also sort of sad process to think about how good my relationship was with my dad at the time that his memory started going. It was like 10 years after my mom had died, just starting to feel like I could blossom my life into what I wanted it to be. And then this new grief with my dad started happening, and then feeling like I was losing more. And it's strange to feel like even though my dad is alive, I don't really feel like I have parents anymore, because the role of being able to call him and say, like, I had a really bad day, or I just want to see how you're doing, or laughing about ridiculous people in our family, or just venting to each other, losing that relationship has been significant. And it's hard to also be with him in those present moments when I know that I can't relate to him in the same way. I can't ask anything of him anymore. And periodically I will, to torture myself, read through emails from my dad from the past, and seeing how smart and articulate and funny he was in his emails just also brings to the forefront how much has been lost and how much he isn't capable of anymore.
To have worked so hard to build that relationship with him after your mom died and to solidify your connection with him and family, and to then at that moment have him start to lose the capacity to be in the relationship in that same way. Well, Camila, I'm thankful for you for having this conversation. I think our show is so focused on the grief after someone dies, and yet there's so much grief in caregiving for someone who has a condition that is changing their physical capacity, mental capacity, emotional capacity. And then the way those two different kinds of grief can really intersect when it's in your family. So thank you for giving voice to that today.
Thank you for having me.
And listeners out there, I say this each and every time, but thank you for being part of our community, for sharing the show with people that you think might be interested in what we're talking about, and for reaching out to me to let me know what the show means to you. If you would like to contact me, you can email me at griefoutloud@dougy.org. That's dougy.org. That's also our main website. So if you want to learn more about our local programming or access any of our free downloadable resources, or find each and every episode of Grief Out Loud, just head to dougy.org. I'm always excited to share. The podcast is sponsored in part by the Chester Stephan Endowment Fund. Grief Out Loud is a production of Dougy Center, the National Grief Center for Children and Families in Portland, Oregon. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us again next time.